Are you wondering if you married the wrong person? That's what I was wondering years ago. This is my new book, Love the One You're With. You're about to hear a sample from Chapter 2, My Story.
Chapter 2 My Story. I have always believed, and I still believe, that whatever good or bad fortune may come our way, we can always give it meaning and transform it into something of value. Hermann Hesse. I understand what you are going through. When I was in junior high, I had a major crush on one of my brother's friends. He was 4 years older than me, so I knew I didn't have a chance with him, but we did become friends over the years. He used to pick me up when I needed a ride before I was old enough to drive. Looking back on it, he also had feelings for me, but in his mind it wasn't appropriate given our age difference. After high school, I moved away to go to college. My brother died in an accident when I was a senior, so I moved back to my hometown after college to be close to my parents. I started spending a lot of time with my brother's friend, and we were both still grieving from the loss. We went camping, cooked dinner, watched movies together, and basically did all the things a couple would do. Eventually, I signed up for a program to teach English in Mexico. 2 days before I left, I was telling my brother's friend how awesome I thought he was, and he kissed me. I thought about it a lot that night and the next day, and decided it would be a terrible mistake to chance messing up our friendship by dating, especially since I was about to be in another country for 5 months. When I told him what I was thinking, he told me he would like to date me if I ever changed my mind. The next day, I was on a plane to Mexico. I couldn't stop thinking about the prospect of being with him, and I even cried when I thought about it. I could come up with a million reasons why we would be a good match. When I got to Mexico, I wrote him a letter telling him how I felt about him, including the fact that I had never understood why people cried when they were happy before. But I was still scared to ruin our friendship, so I sat on the letter for a couple of months. When I still felt the same way after thinking about it for a while, I sent him the letter. At that time, I swore to myself that if we took our friendship to another level, we would get married and stay together forever. When the program was over and I went back home, needless to say, we were excited to see each other. We started dating and had a great time at first, but the spark that I expected was really never there. However, I had made a promise to myself that if I dated him, I would stay with him for the rest of my life, so I lied to myself. A few years later, we got married, and looking back on it, I already knew something was wrong. I was able to convince myself that we had something that most couples didn't have, though, since we had such a strong friendship. Unhappiness started creeping in, and I pushed it down over and over. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore, and sometimes I would go over to my mom's house when she wasn't there to curl up in a ball and cry. I felt so trapped, and I didn't want him to know. My experience with traditional therapy. As graduate school was nearing the end, our plan was to start having kids. I was panicked. I was so scared to get trapped in the marriage, but I was also terrified to leave. I decided to go to therapy to fix the marriage. Therapy was a really good experience for me at first. I figured out why I felt so alone as a child and why I didn't feel deeply connected with anyone. My therapist said it was possible to fix the marriage, but he told a story about himself that changed my mind. He said he was married for several years and they were at a couples retreat when someone came around to check on them. He said all of a sudden it occurred to him that he already knew how to do the work to save his marriage, but he didn't want to do the work with her. When he told this story, it resonated so much with me that I immediately knew I didn't want to save my marriage either. I still wasn't willing to give up, though, so my husband and I started going to couples counseling. It made us both extremely uncomfortable, and things didn't get better. Then one day in a session, my husband had a light bulb moment where he realized that spark had never been there for me. We both knew it was over at that moment. Going through the divorce was absolutely grueling. My worst fear regarding that relationship had come true. I broke his heart and ruined our friendship. I stayed in therapy for years after my divorce to work on myself. I wanted to heal as much as I could so I could be in a healthy relationship and have a happy life. Therapy helped up until a point, but I reached a time where I was no longer receiving any benefits, so I stopped. Becoming a psychotherapist. Through this time, I was a new therapist myself. In my first job out of graduate school, I was working with children and families. I cringe when I think about how little I knew about how to help them back then. And that all changed when a researcher and PhD psychologist took me under her wing and trained me in a parenting intervention called The Incredible Years. I began leading parenting groups, and I watched everything change for these families. There were many principles in the Incredible Years, but the principle that had the biggest impact on families was called the attention principle. It stated that you get more of whatever behavior you focus your attention on. So if you praise and reward the positive things your kids are doing, you will see more of that behavior. But on the flip side, if you focus on and talk about, yell, or criticize the negative behavior, you will also see more of it. At the time, I didn't understand why this worked so well for parents, but now I do, and you will too by the end of this book. A few years later, the same researcher trained me in a very well-known and widely used intervention called cognitive behavioral therapy. The main idea behind this intervention is that your thoughts are directly related to the way you feel and the way you behave. Clients are asked to pay attention to their thoughts and change them to better feeling thoughts. This intervention worked if the clients were diligent about journaling and challenging their limiting beliefs, but most of them felt like it was too much work and they didn't follow through with the assignments. However, years later, I figured out why this intervention can work if you stick with it. Taking therapy to another level. After a while, I started getting bored doing the same things over and over with clients, and I wasn't seeing the kind of results I would have liked. Maybe this is one reason that at the time, I was using these evidence-based interventions on my clients. I was seeking alternative techniques to help heal myself. On some level, I knew my clients and I needed some kind of deeper healing. Years later, when I got married again, I felt like I was ready after being in therapy for years, and this time I married someone who had everything I wanted. We had the friendship and common interests, we were compatible in all the ways I thought were important, and we definitely had that spark. But soon the fears crept in. What if I married the wrong person again? What if this marriage fails just like the last one, and I have to get another divorce? What if it's just not possible for me to stay in a relationship? Luckily, this time, I knew I did want to save my marriage. Remember at the beginning of the book, I asked what it taught me when my seemingly happy parents got a divorce? Well, I discovered it taught me that even the happiest of marriages end in divorce. Having this deep subconscious belief and fear had me creating that in my life for the second time, but this time I knew what to do about it. It would be oversimplifying it if I told you that changing that belief alone turned my marriage around. But I will say that using the techniques I'm going to tell you about later in this book did make me 100% committed to my marriage. In fact, the techniques I'm going to share with you made me feel happy in every area of my life. Eventually, I just couldn't help but to use these techniques on my clients. I was working at a clinic where alternative therapies are frowned upon, but I just couldn't help it. I felt like I had a magic wand and I wasn't allowed to use it. What I discovered was that my clients were getting better and they were getting better fast. People started referring their friends to me. In a very short amount of time, it became evident that the best thing for me to do was go into private practice where I could be honest about what I do and attract the clients who were ready for serious change. In a little more than a year, I had a waiting list. It is a dream of mine to train therapists to incorporate the techniques I use into their therapy practices. But for now, my first step in sharing this with the world is to write this book. And honestly, if it saves just one marriage, it will be worth it to me.